So let's say you're teaching a yoga class and there's this one person in class who clearly isn't into what you're doing. This person is going out of their way to communicate to you that they're not into your class. And that can easily throw you. It's very uncomfortable. Sometimes we go into a deep inward spiral of insecurity. So what do we do in that situation? How do you handle that? And it also goes to something I talk a lot about in terms of purpose. People do asana for different reasons. Like, what are the asana for? Is it to master your body? Is it to purify so you can become enlightened? Or is it some intimate participation with a non-dual existence? These are the kind of questions that we were asking ourselves in my teacher's class this week. And if you don't feel like you have a group of yoga teachers around you that you could engage in dialogue on these kinds of questions, and you would like that, I want to invite you to join us. It's the Jay Brown Yoga Weekly Teachers Class. You can find it at jbrownyoga.com. Okay, here we are. This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown. And wow, if you're a returning listener, that was a quick week, right? Welcome to you if you're new. I don't know about anybody else, but while I don't feel that all was completely lost, I haven't taken much consolation from the fact that 45% of Americans approve of hate. And I guess I just thought there was going to be some kind of feeling of relief, maybe, that never really came. And frankly, my week went real south because early on in it, I woke up one morning and these pain issues in my body came rearing up from the past. Long-time listeners might remember, like a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, I was telling you about this physical pain I was in before I was selling the center, and I was like teaching from a chair, and I was like crying. Maybe you guys remember. Well, that same pain in those same places in my body, I just like woke up with it one morning this week, and it completely threw me. I just didn't see it coming. And I guess I had certainly fallen back into a bit of an old pattern. I was staying up too late. I was working too much. I'm a chronic overworker. You know, teachers always teach the thing that they need most. The reason why I'm like a slow yoga revolution, gentle as the new advanced guy, is because that's what I need. But this pain, it just tears down my like sense of like everything being okay, you know? And I rerouted. I'm feeling better. I canceled some classes and I've been resting over the last day or two. It's gotten a little bit better. But it's terrible timing. I'm leaving this week on this huge New Zealand, Australia trip. I need to like be my best. Maybe that's probably it. I feel like a little bit of pressure because I got this big gig coming up. But really, I just think the universe asserted itself and said, man, you gotta rest a little bit, especially if you're going to take this trip, and just put me down. So I've just been doing triage, trying to take care of myself. I'm betting I'm not the only one. I hope you're doing okay. But I really don't want to spend a lot of time today talking about my pain, because there's bigger issues than just little old me and my suffering. I have an important conversation to share with you today with Gregor Maehle. It was like 6 months ago that I did a series of podcasts with Ashtanga yoga teachers, right when the revelations about Patabhi Jois were really coming out. And it was a big learning experience for me. I did feel like it started some conversations, but ultimately it all died down. It all got quiet again. And then I was watching the Supreme Court confirmation hearings, and I just became incensed and very upset. And in that state, I sent off a slew of emails to some more Ashtanga yoga teachers because I felt like I wanted to start the conversation again. So this is one of 3 attempts at doing just that, at having the hard conversations and trying to get some understanding and ideas about how we might evolve going forward to create a culture that is not so lacking in consent and in mutuality. And I'm grateful to Gregor because he's someone who writes. I've known him for some years from his writing. He tends to write in a very dense, philosophical way that I personally appreciate. I enjoy that kind of writing. And he is somebody who has engaged in deep contemplative sadhana in his life, and I think it comes out in the way that he speaks about yoga and the way that he writes about yoga. And I always knew him as one of those Ashtanga guys. That's what I thought in my mind. Gregor was one of those Ashtanga guys, but he wrote in depth on philosophy. And so a few months back when he wrote his Me Too statement, which was, in my opinion, one of the stronger ones I've seen, it really struck me. I was really grateful that he got back to me and was willing to engage in this candid dialogue that I'm glad that you're going to get to hear today. Before we do, let me ask you if you feel confident about that 20 hours of yoga anatomy you took in your 200-hour training. Because I know the yoga teacher training programs do their best with it, but often we come away from that without feeling all that confident about our handle on human anatomy as yoga teachers. And if that's the case, I want to encourage you to check out longtime friend and today's sponsor of the podcast, yoganatomy.net, and look at their fundamentals course. It's a 20-hour course that you can just take as your own continuing education, or if you conduct a yoga teacher training program, you can plug it right into your training program. That's what I do for my teacher training program. But Leslie Kamenoff and Amy Matthews are the creators of it. They teach yoga anatomy in a very unique way. I have studied with both of them. They've both been on the podcast. You can go back and listen to those episodes. They really are an invaluable resource. If you need to study yoga anatomy or you just want some deep yoga learning, I highly recommend going to yoganatomy.net. Also, if you've been connecting to the podcast and you might like to meet me in person and see if I'm actually for real, I've got some gigs coming up. I'm going to be in Auckland, New Zealand, November 24th and 25th. I'm going to be in London, England, January 11th through 13th. And I'm going to be in Tel Aviv, Israel, January 18th through 20th. You can find out about those gigs and more. You can listen to the archives of this podcast and read my blog and find all of my online yoga video stuff, including my live stream subscription. I'm going to stream some classes while I'm out and about. All of that stuff can be found at jbrownyoga.com. Okay, I'm going to touch base with you on the other side and say a little bit about the episodes that will be following this one. But I think we should just get straight to it. Let's go ahead now and listen to this conversation I had with Gregor Maehle.
Hi, Jay.
Hello, is this Greg?
This is me. Hello, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you doing? I guess, if I'm not mistaken, it's morning time for you, right?
Yes, that's right. It's 11 o'clock and I just finished my practice and breakfast.
Nice, you're in a good state maybe. Where are you? You're in Australia, right?
Yes, that's right. It's the Australian East Coast, precisely speaking, the easternmost point of Australia. There's a bit of a peninsula jutting out into the Pacific. And because of that, it's very, very lush, lots of rainforest around. So it's a beautiful part of the world.
Oh, that sounds nice. I grew up in the suburbs and moved to the big city, and then just a year and a half ago moved out of the city. And now I'm sort of like in the middle between. It's not like very rural, but it's not a city. I can walk 5 minutes and take a hike.
Oh, that's great. And so you are on the American East Coast, aren't you?
Yes, I'm in Pennsylvania now. I was in New York for most of my adult life and recently jumped ship like a lot of other people have.
Okay. Sounds good.
So I'm imagining where you are. And I have a friend who's from that part of the world too. And I think of quite lush, open nature and like riding a horse or something.
Yeah, this is actually where we live, is right in the middle of the rainforest. So we have eagles and snakes and koalas and dingoes and massive lizards. And yes, it's very interesting.
Wow, that's cool. And so where did you grow up?
I'm actually born in a Black Forest in Germany. And slowly more and more upgraded to bigger and bigger cities, and then spent part of my adolescence in Berlin, which was very interesting because of the nightlife. Mm-hmm. But then I started traveling very, very early in my life, and I don't know, I've been probably 15, 16 times around the world, and spent 5 years in India and long time in Thailand and in Indonesia. And so the last 20 years now, Australia is my home.
I see. Well, I'm going to Australia for the first time ever in December.
Okay, great.
I'll be in Sydney just for a weekend, but I'm going back again next year. So I'm excited to be there for the first time.
Great.
Wow. Well, I guess we should. I'm beating around the bush a little bit.
Yes. Get straight into it.
I honestly, I don't know if I mentioned this to you in the email that I sent to you, but I was sitting and I watched the confirmation hearings for the Supreme Court here in the United States not a few weeks back, and I was just so angry and. And it was like maybe 6 months ago that I did these episodes with some Ashtanga teachers after the interview with Karen and Matthew had been released. Mm-hmm. And I had a chance to speak with Karen at that time too. And I was trying to like raise some awareness, and I felt like we did to some degree. But then sitting there watching the confirmation hearings, I just looked back and I was like, oh, well, as often is the case, it did just kind of recede back into a bit of a status quo or something, or like the conversation died down. Mm-hmm. And I remember right after those episodes came out is when you posted your statement. Mm-hmm. And it was one that really stuck out to me because I know you from years. I've followed your writing over the years. We've never met before, but I remember when your Samadhi book came out a few years ago, and I just know in my mind, every time you wrote something and put it out there, it was like a very serious-minded practitioner, and an Ashtanga guy. You were like one of those diehard Ashtanga guys in my mind.
That's right. Yeah.
And so to hear what you wrote was really significant. And so I've been reluctant and kind of a little nervous even to try to start these conversations because it seems like it's very easy for whatever you say to get attacked sometimes. But I felt like, I have to have these conversations. I think we need to have these conversations.
Yes,
and I know a lot of Ashtanga practitioners who are really sincere and really love the practice, And I, just to be honest, I have a very different approach in practice. It doesn't suit me personally, but I know a lot of other people who really love it, and they're just super conflicted, about all of it. So you're someone I felt like who was really trying to point toward some possible ways forward. And I really appreciate that you got back to me and that you were willing to give me some of your time. So just thanks a lot for that off the bat.
Well, thanks for having me. It's a great pleasure, and I hope I can maybe be of some help.
Okay, well, we sort of started with some of your history, and I do want to just take a little time, just because if people listening don't know who you are, I think it's good to set some context for the perspective that you're offering on the tradition. And I know I read in your bio first that it was like 1978, and it says that you started with a Raja Yoga practice, and then it was like in the mid-'80s that you started to get into other stuff. So I'm curious, what was the form of that Raja practice? What does that mean? Was it like sitting or studying texts, or what was your initial practice if it wasn't asana?
Yeah, let me start even earlier. Like I was, even in my childhood, I would say that I was mainly interested. I thought that there was something not right, with the reality that was dished out to me by society. And right from the very early beginning, I looked for examples of mysticism, as I would call it now. And, early in my life, that was mainly the Old Testament of the Bible. I was really attracted to those Old Testament prophets. And then when I was 12 years old, I got into Buddhism, and later then into the Upanishads. And I was quite lucky to meet teachers very early in my life. I had sort of like the first formal Raja Yoga teacher when I was 17 years old. And we did a little bit of asana back then, just to stretch and get loose and to be able to sit properly. But once we got started with meditation, he usually started with explaining something from the Upanishads. He would grab a passage from the Upanishads, explain it, and then we would do meditation exercises, which started with meditating on sacred objects, using mantra, meditating on sacred geometry, and on and off meditating on what you would call consciousness or awareness. So it was quite a fine example of Raja Yoga that I got into quite early.
17, that's pretty young. I was doing other stupid stuff, not that.
Well, I was doing them too at the site. That was sort of like a second line of inquiry, if I may say.
I got you. But still, at least that was partly going in too. That was in there.
But, it's quite interesting, when you look, for example, I got really, really early on in my life, I got sucked into beatnik philosophy, I read and met, for example, Allen Ginsberg and a couple of others of those guys early in my life. And, if you look at that, there was, like living intensely, at the same time, there was, a lot of spirituality, like reading texts, there was definitely a lot of Zen Buddhism, etc.
Right. And so I know in the mid-'80s is when you start making trips to India, and that just becomes a natural offshoot of those early experiences, right? What was were you going to find a guru, or were you just, what was your...
Yes, very much so. I sort of realized that I needed to have some personal instruction. I wasn't really clear enough, and I wasn't really... I thought I needed help. And I sort of like hit very quickly what was then called the guru trial. There was sort of a trial going through India in those days, where you basically went from guru to guru.
Well, I've had a number of people like of your generation on, and it seems to be a very common theme. It's like the Beatles showed everybody the guy in India, and then everybody wanted to go find a guru, and getting to India wasn't that easy, and you had to like fly into some other place and like go over the hills on the Hashish Trail. So I've heard a bunch of stories about what it was like back then, and a lot of people were like you said, beatnik culture were making trips there to find gurus, and you were one of them.
That's right, and sort of, like, if I may share memory, I ended up in Hampi in 1984, which is the former capital of the kingdom, Vijayanagar, and it was a city that is very, very similar to in the Jungle Book, the city where the monkeys live. It was totally overgrown, ruins, river going through, massive rock fields and everything. And I ended up there when I was 20 years old. And there was basically, probably like a few dozen of Hindu ascetic sadhus, and then a bunch of hippies, and a few real life tigers. So that was just something that really, it was amazing to see that at the age of 20. It sort of like pulled me right out of my context where I was before.
Well, I understand. I took a trip to India in my early 20s too, but it was 1998. And I didn't find that, though, honestly. I found like a lot of other stuff that wasn't that. I did find one teacher in Rishikesh that's more like an authentic something like you're describing, but a lot of other things I found was like people trying to make money off the tourist trade and like a lot of other stuff going on too,
Yeah. And I think that, my feeling is that, that ancient authentic culture sort of probably like a lot of it has disappeared due to commerce, as that is happening everywhere, where market economy just turns everything into a commodity. So, that is the same in India too.
Well, I also noticed in your bio that it said that you practiced with BKS Iyengar before you practiced with Mr. Patabhi Jois, and I'm curious about that. How did you end up studying with him, or how did you find your way to asana and then to him?
Well, I wasn't initially very interested in asana because I was on, let's call it the instant enlightenment trip. So I would sort out every teacher that wasn't promising me that they could lead me to enlightenment in 2 years, or faster if possible, please. And look, I guess by definition, I sorted out all of the good ones, because of course you can make lots of money if you promise people, are going to get you there in 2 years or less, in 6 months, or some teachers even said in 2 weeks, no problem. And I did that for quite a few years, So for most of the 1980s, I was more or less stuck in that. And India back then was a very rough place. So for your health, there were no amenities whatsoever. There was no drinking water, and so I contracted pretty much every tropical disease in the book. And I think when I was 26, 27, I looked at myself in the mirror and I realized, well, Gregor, your body is not going to make it. You're just going to do something for your body. And then I thought, there's this asana thing. Maybe we look a bit more into it. And this is really how I ended up at Iyengar's school and also at Patabhi Jois' school, because I thought, there needs to be part of this teaching that attends a bit more to the body than I used to do.
And what was your experience of Mr. Iyengar?
Look, I personally didn't tick with him. I sort of managed to develop a rapport with Patabhi Jois. I didn't so much with BKS Iyengar. BKS Iyengar seemed to be a person that carried a lot of anger. And there were sort of instances, I must admit that my asana practice looked pretty bad back then, so it's sort of a bit understandable, but he just, a couple of times, just totally, because Iyengar blew his top at me, and sort of looked at him and I thought, well, I don't want to end up, if that's where yoga took you, that's not where I want to end up, But look, it's probably like, it was more of a personal thing that I didn't tick with him because of that. Of course, he has made a contribution, a valid contribution, so, I don't want to...
I mean, I don't think that it's this discussion for us to have today, but there's a lot going on in that community as well, right?
Yes, I'm very well aware. Of course, there was a lot of people would get smacked around the head and so on. There was a lot of physical abuse going on. Yes.
Well, I mean, even it's funny we bring that up because I almost think there's the sexual assaults and then there's the aggressive adjustments. And in my mind, I mean, there's certainly something like a power thing that's underneath both of them, but they are different, you know, I know that, you know, even in the younger community right now, they have this other senior teacher. It's not Mr. Iyengar, who apparently there was some kind of cover up, you know what's going on. So
yeah, I'm aware of the whole story.
Yeah. Anyway, so it's happening in all of the traditions, it seems like.
It is. It is, yes. And, you know, you can pretty much say that it happens everywhere in life, everywhere in the world where there's a power gradient, yeah? Mm-hmm. So, you know, wherever there is a power gradient and there are some people who are very much empowered and they are meeting people who are disempowered, whether it's yoga or whether it's anything else, you know, whether it's politics, whether it's business, you will have this, unfortunately, this aspect of abuse coming in. Mm.
But you didn't feel that abuse with Patabhi Jois when you first met him.
Look, I would say that I probably did. Yes, I did. Mm. But I had sort of a previous history rejecting several gurus beforehand because of that, because I saw stuff like that going on. And I think that when I came to Patabhi Jois, I came to the point where I was really questioning myself, you know. I was thinking, look, you see that wherever you look, it must be something wrong with you, yeah. So, you know, previously, you know, like I was, for example, for quite some time in the Rajneesh movement, and I was in Satya Sai Baba's community, etc., quite a few. And I was sort of a person that was always, hey, did you just see that the guru did this and this and this? And then I got this thing, drop your mind, drop your ego, you know, in order for you to spiritually grow, you need to totally surrender to the guru. And I was told over and over again that. And so I think that when I arrived at Patabhi Jois's, I was sort of really starting to questioning myself. You know, I was still quite young, you know, and I wasn't really prepared to admit to myself that that stuff was going on in pretty much every spiritual community where I ended up, you know. Meanwhile, I could take that step, you know, but but back then I just wasn't capable of doing that. So I thought, okay, I'm seeing this stuff. It's, again, you, Gregor, it's your ego. It is this and this and this. So you just got to surrender.
And what was your experience of doing the practice? So what you spent 14 months in Mysore?
That's right. So, that's right. Over several trips.
So what happened? What happened for you in the practice that changed?
Well, what happened in the practice was that it was exactly what I needed, to grow and to integrate, to combine physical and spiritual aspects of yoga. Yeah. So the Ashtanga Vinyasa practice was exactly what I needed. So to some extent, it would be easier now for me to reject the whole thing all out, you know, because whatever has happened, but I can't, you know. I'm one of those people where Patabhi Jois made an incredible impact on my body, you know, on my health, and then to be able to, let's say, produce this body that is capable to sit in Padmasana for hours, you know. And so the physical practice was a 100% full-on success for me. You know, that's probably one of the reasons why it took me such a long time to realize, well, there's some weird stuff going on here, which we need to address.
Well, how long, I know it says in your bio, it was 1997 when you were authorized to teach. How long had you been practicing with him before that?
I was practicing Ashtanga Yoga by then 7 years. But, you know, sort of there were Iyengar periods in there, but altogether I was practicing 7 years Ashtanga. I was in my 8th year. And with Patabhi Jois, I got authorized when I was practicing around 11 months. I think he authorized me after the 11th month, separate over 3 or 4 trips.
And what did that entail? I've often had people talk about how it's kind of evolved and changed the process by which someone gets authorized. How did you get authorized? Did he just like give you the nod, or how did it happen?
Yes. So back in those days, there was no certificate and there was no letter. There were certificates. Yes. But for certificates, you needed to come back 10 times or something like that. So with the authorization, we sort of knew that he wanted you to do either the full intermediate series, or at least that you're at a point where you see, you're probably going to finish it now in a couple of months. And then you simply asked him and he would say yes or no. Yeah, and that was it.
Mm-hmm. But you had to ask.
Yes, you had to ask. Yes, I think that that was very rare that he told people, okay, you go off and teach. You had to ask whether he deemed you ready or not. At least that's how it was in those days.
Hmm. And were you teaching back home?
I was assisting at that point, and I was only starting my own classes after that, to be honest.
Mm-hmm. And I also saw a note that it says you lived for several years as a recluse. When did that happen?
Well, that happened quite early, on and off, I spent probably when I was 17 years old, I lived for a couple of months at the Costa del Sol in a cave in Spain. And then I spent quite a bit of time living in the forest in Germany, even sometimes sometimes in winter, but it was quite uncomfortable. But this particular period that I refer to when I write about it in my biography was simply, I was teaching yoga already, and I just basically had this compound, you could say, in one of the suburbs, where I built a 6-foot limestone wall around it, and I landscaped it beautifully with ponds and waterfalls and a meditation hut and lotus ponds and all of that stuff. And I was basically in there for almost 10 years, yeah. And during that time, I pretty much did only practice, went out to teach a class per day usually. And I taught one Mysore style class per day and then a Yoga Sutra class per week. And
you were able to sustain, pay your rent or whatever like that?
Well, because the yoga sustained me. Yes, that's right. I did. Yeah,
wow.
I sort of was quite lucky in that regard. Yeah.
Yeah. And so you did that's some pretty intensive sadhana.
Very intensive sadhana, yeah. And I had also I was studying Sanskrit during that time too. I had a bit of previous Sanskrit experience in India, and I just brought shiploads of books. And I just was basically just studying, reading texts, and then putting into practice what I was reading.
And I just think that not everybody has an impulse to kind of remove themselves like that. I mean, you said early on you had sort of drives or impulses in that direction.
Yes.
But you did decide to leave that kind of compound, right?
Yes, well, to be honest, I left it for something that is even more extreme. We are now I live with my wife on a mountaintop within a rainforest. And it's sort of like a kilometer probably to the next house. Our next neighbor is a kilometer.
Yeah.
And it's not even easy to get there. And the next town would be about 20 minutes. So in some regards, it's more extreme. But I noticed I've started now to travel and teach. I started probably 2-3 years ago only. And I noticed that those two things fit well together, because I go out, maybe have a 4 to 6 week teaching period, then I come home for a month or so, and I'm on the mountain going full on back into my contemplative practices. That fits quite well together.
Well, also though, you're not alone.
Yes.
That's a difference.
That's right. Yes, that's right. Although my wife tends to think that I'm sometimes a bit boring or too extreme.
What I will say is I did not have the same kind of intensive sadhana that you did, but there was certainly a period in my time where I followed a lot of those things, and I did a lot of intensive practice, and I was all by myself for many years as an adult. And at a certain point, I almost felt like I would have a meditation and have these inward kind of wonderful experiences very often, but then my life was kind of a wreck because I didn't have any relationships or anything, and it was almost like my meditation was making my life worse at some point. And I had to find a way to integrate more, which I did, and then everything worked out. But like, I kind of understand where at some point my spiritual practice really benefited from having a partner, is what I'm kind of getting to.
Yes, I totally agree with that. And I think that I think it's very good also to go out and interact with people. You know, I want to not like lionize that spiritual recluse life too much, because I think that is also detrimental. It can be detrimental, you know. I sort of realized at some point that my life wasn't, I use this terminology, not just about my own private shabby little enlightenment. Yeah. But, you know, I think that at a certain point.
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of J. Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.